1 cash. When the first quarry worker received his earnings in pebbles at the very first quarry, he was aware of the effort and hardships that each of these pebbles had to be earned with. This fact gave the pebbles a very special power. He had created the pebbles and thus the force with which they were charged. This stone force possessed a unique allure, as it could be exchanged for work at any time. However, the quarry worker also recognized that he had to exchange his lifetime for the pebbles to secure his livelihood. The idea that this would remain the case forever overwhelmed him. If something were to change in this condition someday, he had to take matters into his own hands and establish his own quarry. However, for this, he would need a few stones to start with, and so the quarry worker said, "He who does not honor the pebbles is not worthy of the stone," and saved every pebble he could save. To trade. One day, on his way home from work at the quarry worker passed by a property that was up for sale. The owner had dug in vain for a vein of stone, and now he wanted to sell the property again. The quarry worker immediately recognized, through his many years of working with stones, the potential that the property held, and was certain that there were stones there that the current owner simply didn't recognize. Fueled by this thought, the efforts of the workday were swept away, and the quarry worker spent the whole night planning for the property. As the early hours of the morning arrived, the quarry worker had made up his mind. Yes, the property would cost him all his savings, and yes, everything was calculated very tightly, and yes, it would take a decade to work on a second attempt. But the all-important nevertheless had already taken root because the vision of what could be there one day overwhelmed him. He purchased the property even before the start of work at the quarry. 3. Menhir and the quarry worker dug on his property every day after work at the quarry until one day he didn't find a vein of stone, but instead he discovered the largest stone he had ever seen. Although it was a beautiful find, when compared to the total number of pebbles, it wasn't the hoped-for big deal he had dreamed of, and he thought, if he managed not to see the force of stones as a one-way street where work and lifetime could transform into stone, then the stone's force could also flow back into people. With such a large stone, just its touch or even its mere presence nearby should be enough to generate the stone's force. It would then be the first inexhaustible pebble. He would be capable of constantly seeking new pebbles on his own, directly producing the stone's force. The idea of being able to create the stone's force out of nothing overwhelmed him. So, right after making the first investment of his life, he decided to make the second one and not give away the large stone for pebbles. As an eternal pebble, he would be more than the sum of his parts. And so, the quarry worker placed the largest stone into the ground and stood it upright. From then on, he became the owner of a menhir, and the stone became a menhir. 4. Monopole. When the owner of the menhir touched his menhir for the first time, he knew he had been right. The menhir transmitted its force only through touch. In that moment, the idea of finally quitting his job at the quarry came to him, and this thought overwhelmed him. He built a wall around the menhir, and from then on he no longer sold his lifetime, but instead rented out the stone forces he had created. 5. Loss. The fact that only one person could generate the power of the stone from nothing made the guardian of the stones jealous. She deemed it unfair to those who had to toil in the quarry for their pebbles. Thus, she sent her minions to destroy the menhir stone. As a result, in a single fateful night, the menhir was shattered. When the menhir's owner arrived at his property in the morning to start renting out his menhir, he was devastated, just like his menhir. Everything he had fought for, suffered for, and paid for seemed lost. But as the menhir's owner saw the debris of his menhir lying on the ground, he remembered his early days in the quarry, and the idea of having to go back there overwhelmed him. 6. Scale. And so the menhir's owner thought, even if the trade is small, it brings me more than labor does, And he said, I have understood the stone's force better than anyone else. If the stone's force doesn't depend on the stones themselves, then I can still extract stone force from the splinters. And the splinters continued to produce stone force. And he said, the pebbles are lying on the road, one just has to pick them up. And so the menhir's owner sold the splinters and became richer than ever before, and the idea of his success overwhelmed him. 7. Patron. As he now possessed more pebbles than ever before, and was a great connoisseur of stone, he generously commissioned sculptures with the surplus from the menhir sales. He only bought the best, and paid any price for it. The fact that even menhirs do not reproduce on their own, and the idea that they could one day be all consumed, overwhelmed him. 8. Invest. Now, the menhir's owner was confronted with the task of deciding what to do with his remaining wealth, and so the menhir's owner recalled the time when he was first in a position to buy something so useful that it could profoundly change the fundamental conditions of his life. He felt the same enthusiasm with which he had examined the deal back then. The idea of getting the maximum stone force for every pebble spent overwhelmed him. And so it happened that the menhir's owner exchanged all the remaining menhir splinters for the quarry where he had once toiled. 9 Economies. As the menhir's owner became widely known across the lands and had previously bought stone art in large quantities, a real boom had now broken out. Everyone wanted to buy stone art, and as a result, the order books of the quarry were bursting with demand. The idea that the stone force was flowing in a circle overwhelmed him. 10 Harvests. With the profits from the quarry, the menhir's owner financed many other businesses, and through the miracle of interest he became richer than ever before. This idea overwhelmed him, and so he said, I don't have many pebbles because I pay good wages, but I have many pebbles because I pay good wages. And at the end of each month, the menhir's owner paid a bonus to his workers in the quarry.